The Inventor. A blanket of papers lay strewn about the warehouse floor. Each sheet, once covered in equations and sketches, was now blackened by enraged scribbles. The pages themselves hid tools, scrap metal, leather straps, and other objects that had been tossed to the ground days ago and not thought of since. In the corner of the warehouse, amidst a tall pile of crumpled papers, stood a man beside a desk. One of his pale, bruised hands clutched a dying pen, while the other's palm was pressed against his forehead, fingers covered by unkempt brown hair. His eyes stared through thick lenses fixated on the open notebook that lay in front of him, gaunt and blank. He had hardly moved in hours. His stomach clawed at him from within. His throat screamed for an oasis, but his feet stayed in place. His thoughts were elsewhere. Ideas swirled in a maelstrom within the inventor's mind. Gadgets, weapons, armors, tools. Dozens of inventions that could better the world. However, all he could envision was outlines, rough concepts of what these creations would be. But if he could grasp one, just one, then... A drop of blood fell from his nose, landing just beside the notebook. His focus was shattered. He set the pen down and brought his hand to his nose, wincing as he made contact. More blood began to fall, forcing him away from the desk. He waded through the sea of pages to find a tissue as his memory returned to the meeting he had earlier that day. The creditor had been kept waiting too long. She had taken notice of the inventor's top-of-class graduation, and, even though he had yet to prove his skill, she saw talent in the young man. She approached him and offered a steady flow of funds in a small, secluded warehouse in exchange for a split of the profits he made on his inventions. A deal he gladly accepted. Months passed. No invention had taken form, and the creditor felt slighted. She called the inventor to her office and gave an ultimatum. Have an invention ready within 24 hours, or she would torture him with every last thing he had spent her money on. To prove she was a woman of her word, her cane and boot met intimately with the inventor's body. She then had him locked inside the warehouse, with all exits guarded. 17 hours had passed since the last door was sealed, and all the inventor had created was a series of disemboweled notebooks. Unable to find a tissue, the inventor grabbed a wadded page from the ground and stuffed it into his bleeding nostril before returning to his desk. His gaze aimed at the notebook again. Its white pages were laughing, jeering. He shut his eyes to concentrate, reaching out into the vortex of his mind. The inventions dissolved the moment he tried to grasp them. Impossible structures, uncertain reactions, materials with properties that mankind had no access to. He found nothing but these reasons and more why they could never be made reality. Not in his lifetime, which he knew was dwindling by the minute. Then an idea came to him. A horseless carriage, twice as fast as one pulled by even two steeds. He opened his eyes, grabbed his pen, and pressed it to the blank page. But he did not begin to write. Incredulity held his body hostage as cynicism took over his thoughts once more. This invention, just as all the others, was nothing more than blind hope. The inventor lifted the pen from the page, his hand quaking. A small dot of ink was left behind, a mocking abyss that consumed his plans. He stared at the speck. Minutes passed, and his gaze never wavered. His hands began to shake more violently. He brought a hand to the cover and slammed the notebook shut, breathing deep. After a moment, he set his eyes on the journal itself. It was dwindling away, just as the dozens of others he had used had done. This was the final notebook in his possession. Its pages were sure to run out soon enough, and the inventor would be left to scribble on the walls, something he was fully prepared to do. Near the bottom of the journal's cover, a name was written in ink. The inventor hadn't noticed it in his mad scramble for another place to sketch, but in this brief moment of calm he had no choice. The name belonged to one of his peers from university, a kind fellow who the inventor got along with well, but hardly a creative mind. He had dropped out of the classes not long after they began, leaving his notebook to the inventor, mentioning something about wanting a pristine notebook for the next course he took. Thinking back to his time at university reminded the inventor of the promise he had, an era of potential and talent, both of which he no longer felt he possessed. He remembered the praise he had received from his classmates and professors. His fists clenched and teeth gritted at the thought. He took hold of the notebook and swept it aside, a yawp crawling out of his parched throat. The journal collided with the wall, pages flapping, full resting at the edge of the desk. Tears beaded at the corners of the inventor's eyes. He removed his glasses and set them on the table before bringing his hands to his face. He wiped the tears away, but they returned all the same. He didn't bother fighting them again. The drops fell onto the table, marrying the now coagulated blood that had earlier fallen from his nose. He was not sure how long he had cried, but the time spent did not matter. It was all a fool's errand, and he knew it from the start. The creditor no longer cared for inventions. She only wanted to make him suffer, psychologically and physically. Despite it all, the hurricane of the inventor's mind continued to wreak destruction on his thoughts, its eye nothing but calm despondency. After some time, his tears refused to flow any longer. He wiped their remains from his face and donned his glasses again. He turned and looked around the warehouse. The entire building was a monument to his failure, and soon it would be a mausoleum. The inventor altered his gaze to face the journal, which lay splayed open on the far side of the desk where he had tossed it. He stepped over, ready to release more of his ire upon the notebook, when he noticed that the exposed papers had already been written in. As he got close, he saw an elaborate diagram, sprawled across both open pages. He grasped the journal and inspected the writing, his breath quickening. The signature of his peer from university was scrawled along the bottom of the blueprint. The design itself was incredibly crude, so much so that it pained the inventor to look at, but as he looked over the illustration, the equations and notes, he could tell that it had promise. The blueprint depicted a small machine, capable of generating power without a catalyst, albeit in small quantities. This generator was the answer for so many of the inventor's failed ideas. Fireless lamps, horseless carriages, all of them. And as the inventor looked once more at the components for the contraption, he found that everything he needed to construct it was within the warehouse. He dashed about the building, gathering every last material he needed. He worked tirelessly on the machine, further ignoring his body's cries for aid, working through the aches and pains to ensure that he would not fail. Unlike how he had done in the past, he cut no corners. He made sure to follow everything the design called for, no matter how hideous the final product would be. After 4 hours of work, he had finished the first prototype. It looked identical to the original drawing. A strange, unwalled box stuffed full of metal and pulleys. It had no discernible front or back, and the starter cable and off lever sticking out from the top were the only things differentiating that side from the bottom. Regardless of its appearance, for the first time in his life, the inventor felt an abundance of confidence. This unsightly apparatus would function. The inventor took hold of the starter cable and pulled with as much force as he could muster. The machine sprung to life, sputtering but stable. Small bursts of gray smoke billowed from each side every few seconds. It let out an occasional high-pitched whine, but it ended almost immediately after it began. The inventor kept it running for a moment to ensure that it would suffer no severe problems, but also to come to terms with what he had finally created. He pulled the lever to stop the generator, and took several steps back. A small chuckle flew from his lips, tears beading at his eyes once more. He brought a hand to his mouth and took deep breaths. The machine worked. He won. But why should he stop there? The inventor's thoughts turned to the creditor, a vile woman grown far too comfortable in her seat of power. She wouldn't stop at taking control of the generator. She wouldn't consider it to be a proper return on her investment. The inventor would remain under her thumb, and many more were sure to fall victim. An urge arose in his chest, one of both revenge and nobility, or so he told himself. His mind conceived a new idea, reminiscent of experiments he performed while still a student. He inspected the generator, checking to see if his plan would yield results. With some refinements and repurposes, this machine could become a weapon. As rudimentary as the machine itself, but a powerful weapon nonetheless. After collecting the materials, he got to work on the engine once again. He converted a section of it to allow for an extension, as well as attaching a wide strap. It took him nearly 3 hours to complete the modification, but it was still not how he first envisioned it. However, the creditor would be arriving soon, and he had no choice but to forego the safety measures he initially planned for. He took one final look at the engine. The power generator itself was nearly identical to before, but it was now attached to a short iron rod. At the tip of the rod was a hollow aluminum ball with a spike protruding from the end opposite of the handle. At the bottom of the rod were 2 copper coils connecting it to the generator. The final modification was a small switch located beside the starter cable. If the inventor's modifications worked as intended, he would be able to emit the energy created by the machine from the tip of the rod. He strapped the generator around his waist. It hung loose but held. The inventor then grabbed the thickest mitt he could find, a loose blacksmithing glove. He put it on his right hand and took hold of the conducting rod. Finally, after taking a deep breath, he pulled on the starter cable with his free hand. The generator purred to life once again, coughing and whining, but alive. The inventor raised the conducting rod and pointed it towards a leather hide hanging from the wall, something he had experimented on in the past. He held his breath and brought his left hand to the small switch on the generator. His finger was quaking, but he forced it to flip the switch to the on position. A bolt of lightning shot out from the tip of the conducting rod, letting out a subtle crackling sound. Cut through the air in an instant, striking the leather hide exactly where the inventor had aimed it. He let out a yelp of surprise. The generator grew louder, but it seemed to be holding steady, though it spewed out more smoke than when it was idling. The arc of lightning never broke from the rod to the hide. It branched out slightly, but it never touched anything but its target. The inventor could feel raw, wanton power flowing through the conducting rod as he held it. He felt very little resistance, and he could focus on aiming the arcing lightning wherever he pleased. He directed it all around the leather hide, leaving a charred trail behind where it struck. After allowing the bolt to discharge for a moment, the inventor returned the switch to the off position. The generator never faltered throughout the test. The weapon worked exactly as he had planned. The inventor couldn't help but laugh to himself. He clutched the conducting rod tighter in his gloved hand. The creditor would pay for everything she had done, to him and all others she had wronged. The inventor let loose another blast of lightning at the hide, then another, and another. The generator held through it all, and each bolt was as steady as the last. He was about to unleash one more when he heard the front door to the warehouse begin to unlock. He turned to face the entrance and shut off the generator. He wanted to see the look on the creditor's face when she saw that he had bested her. The entry was unsealed and opened. The creditor was the first to step inside. The inventor felt his heart rate increase at the sight of her. The smug smile she wore, the gaudy clothes, bright jewelry, studded cane. All of it served to incense the inventor further. Following the creditor was 3 of her henchmen, muscular thugs with holstered blades, who hadn't had a thought grace their unwrinkled brains since childhood. They only served to enable the creditor's merciless actions, and as such, the inventor had a dispatch of them all the same. The creditor didn't walk far into the warehouse before stopping. She left around 15 feet between herself and the inventor. Despite the distance, the inventor could see her eyes focus down on the generator at his hip. Her smile grew as she shifted her gaze to his face. The inventor knew an irreverent comment was incoming, and he decided to stifle it. The inventor pulled the starter rope, spurring the generator to life once more. All skepticism flushed from the creditor's face. Surprise deepened the wrinkles on her forehead, and her mouth turned agape. After a few seconds, the astonishment was replaced with a greedy smirk. She raised a hand towards the inventor and opened her mouth to speak, but the inventor was not intent on listening. He aimed the conducting rod at one of the henchmen and quickly flipped the switch on and off. A short lightning bolt fired out and struck the man in the chest, knocking him backwards and ending his life. The creditor and the other cronies took a quick glance at the deceased before turning back to the inventor, each eye wider than he had ever seen. He felt a smile creep onto his face as he redirected the rod's point at another henchman. He wanted the creditor to experience his fury last. The henchmen pulled their knives from their belts as the creditor ducked down behind a table. The inventor let loose another blast, keeping it focused for a few seconds. The henchman he struck released his knife and shook violently as the electricity coursed throughout his body. The final goon let out a scream and began to sprint forward. The inventor switched off the conductor and swung the rod, striking the lackey in the face. The henchman stumbled backward with his hand clutching at the point of impact. The inventor aimed the rod at him and fired it quickly again. The henchman collapsed to the ground, his heart still. Cackling, the inventor began to walk towards where the creditor had taken cover. He tapped the conducting rod against the table, sending a metallic, echoing taunt throughout the warehouse. The hag's pawns were dead, and she was next. The inventor took several deep breaths before he turned the corner of the table. He would relish this for the rest of his life. The inventor looked behind the table, but there was nobody there. His eyes widened and looked to the front door. It was the only exit that was unlocked, and he would have certainly noticed her trying to leave, even amidst the chaos. She was still within the warehouse somewhere, hiding from him. He knew the building well, and there was very little for her to hide behind or within. It wouldn't take long to find her, and he would finally be able to. The sound of hurried footsteps behind him roused the inventor from his violent thoughts. He spun around just in time to see the creditor swinging her cane at his face. It collided with his jaw, sending him staggering away. He couldn't recover before another blow was struck on the top of his head. He swung out with the conducting rod, but the creditor dodged it. She bashed down on his right arm twice in quick succession. The inventor's grip on the rod loosened, and it collided with the floor. He tried to grab for it, but the creditor swung the cane at his hand once more, smacking it away and knocking off the blacksmithing glove. The creditor allowed him no quarter, staying close to him as he tried to back away. She brought the cane down upon him, again and again. The inventor tried to fight back with his bare hands, but the creditor was quick to smack them away. In an act of desperation, the inventor reached for the conducting rod. He managed to grab it between the creditor's frenzied strikes and swung the rod at her legs. It collided, arising a squawk from the creditor's lips, and the briefest of reprieves from her assault. He used the time to stab the tip of the lightning rod into the creditor's leg, forcing her to back away. A frantic thought entered the inventor's mind. He knew he no longer wore the blacksmithing glove, and it was too far away to make a dash for. To try would be to make himself vulnerable to the creditor's barrage once more. He could attempt to fight back with just the conducting rod, but he was sure to lose. He hadn't slept in over a day and eaten very little. His strength would not hold out. He saw only one option, one that would likely kill him. But he would rather die and ensure the creditor could terrorize no longer than live as her helot. The inventor clasped his bare right hand down harder on the conducting rod and took a few steps back. He aimed it directly at the creditor's head, who had just begun to recover from his retaliations. The inventor stared directly into her eyes, watching panic wash through them. She knew what he was about to do. A shout started to escape her throat right as the inventor flipped the switch. A jolt of power ran through the inventor's arm, reverberating through his entire body. His hand clenched tighter around the conducting rod, more than any human could do on their own. His muscles shook violently, disrupting his aim of the lightning, but he managed to keep it focused on the creditor's body. She convulsed just as he did, screaming all the while. The inventor could feel the skin of his hand melting, turning to putty. He glanced downward, seeing the molten dermis cover the metal of the rod. His muscles burned from the extremity of contraction. The fingernails on his left hand dug deep into his palm, but he refused to cease. The creditor's once opulent clothes had begun to smolder. She was no longer screaming. Nothing but the cranking of the generator and the hum of the conducting rod filled the air. The engine began to struggle, sputtering out smoke and whining more frequently. The arc of lightning had started to become unstable. It branched outward from its body, first attracted to the various metal objects scattered about, then leaping to anything in between the inventor and the creditor. The walls, tables, crumpled papers, all of them invoked the rage of the storm, igniting in a wild blaze. The fire quickly spread throughout the warehouse, fueled by the sea of pages the inventor had thrown about. Startled at the sight of the sudden inferno, the inventor moved his left hand to the switch. The violent shaking made it difficult to reach, and he failed to stop the impetuous static from causing more destruction for several seconds before he finally managed to end it. The relief he felt was unlike any other. His entire right arm was numb, and every inch of his body screamed in torment. He felt ready to collapse, to lose consciousness, but he shook himself awake. He slowly turned to the exit and forced himself to march, step by step. The conflagration roared behind him, but he dared not turn to look. He kept his focus on moving forward, and repeated one phrase to himself. "You are alive." He trudged through the front door and continued for another few feet before allowing his legs to rest. He looked down to his right hand. Branching red marks stretched all across his arm, growing thicker and brighter the closer they were to the conducting rod. The hand itself was no longer recognizable as such. The skin had already begun to solidify, leaving no trace of distinct digits, other than the remnants of fingernails left behind. He tried to move his fingers beneath the congealed skin, but he wasn't sure they obeyed. No feeling had returned to the extremity. The piercing sound of cracking wood tore the inventor's attention away from his arm and back to the destruction. The fire had begun to engulf the entire building. Through the entrance, now covered in smoke and charred wood, the inventor saw the stiff body of the creditor, ablaze. A small, grim smile came to his face for a brief second, wiped away as the roof of the warehouse fractured and caved in, concealing everything within in soot. The inventor stood in place, mouth agape and eyes fixated on the desolation before him. As the beams disintegrated, the ideas he once held in abundance began to vacate his mind. One by one, they disappeared, not a trace left in his memory. The warehouse continued to crumble, consumed by the raging fire. In minutes, the previously impressive building had fallen to nothing but a blazing pile of wood. When the inferno had imbibed all it could, and the warehouse was nothing more than glowing ash, the inventor remained in place. His thoughts, finally, were still.